Connor Walsh was a ghost in the streets of Dublin. Liam Redford ran the docks of Liverpool with a steel grip. Together, they built a drug empire that silently flooded two cities until one of them broke the code of silence. In the heart of Dublin, beneath the cobblestone streets and historic buildings, a quiet but dangerous transformation was underway. What began as a small group of street-level dealers operating in the shadows was evolving into something much larger and more sinister, a well-organized drug cartel with far-reaching ambition. The streets, once filled with the sounds of daily life and local chatter, were slowly becoming the stage for a criminal empire that would stretch across borders and seas. The cartel's origins were humble. A few individuals who had grown tired of the instability and low profits of street dealing started to think bigger. They saw the city's docks, not just as a place to hide drugs, but as a gateway to international markets. Abandoned warehouses and unused shipping containers became their new storage rooms, cleverly concealed from the eyes of the authorities. Each shipment was carefully planned, with routes designed to avoid checkpoints and inspections. The group's discipline and secrecy were unlike anything local police had seen before. Detectives working on drug enforcement noticed an increase in drug-related incidents, but struggled to connect the dots. There was no obvious leader, no public figure coordinating the operations. Instead, the cartel operated like a shadow, invisible but powerful. The gang's members communicated through encrypted messages and met in hidden locations, always wary of being watched or betrayed. At the same time, the community was beginning to feel the effects. More young people were getting involved in drugs, both as users and as part of the distribution network. Neighborhoods that once had a sense of safety now lived with a quiet fear, unsure of who was involved or when violence might erupt. The cartel's influence spread silently, wrapping itself around the city's edges and drawing in those desperate for money or protection. The leaders of the cartel were careful to avoid unnecessary violence, knowing that too much attention could bring a heavy police crackdown. Instead, they focused on expanding their control over the drug supply, building relationships with contacts in other cities, and improving their smuggling methods. Every success gave them confidence, making them bolder and more ambitious. As Dublin streets watched in uneasy silence, the cartel's operation grew stronger, preparing to cross the waters to Liverpool. What started as a small hidden threat was becoming a criminal force that would soon reach far beyond the city's limits, setting the stage for a dangerous pipeline that could change the lives of thousands. The cartel's success wasn't just luck. It was the result of careful planning and clever tactics that allowed them to stay one step ahead of the law. They understood that smuggling drugs wasn't just about moving packages, it was a game of deception and strategy. The members became experts at hiding their cargo in plain sight, blending illegal shipments with everyday goods that passed through ports without raising suspicion. The cartel also studied the behavior of law enforcement closely. They learned when inspections were most likely and how officers identified suspicious shipments. Using this knowledge, they created decoy shipments designed to attract attention, allowing the real drug loads to pass unnoticed. At times they sent fake shipments on routes that were heavily monitored, drawing resources away from the true routes where the drugs were moving. Communication was another crucial part of their success. The cartel used encrypted messaging apps and code words to avoid interception. Meetings were held in discreet locations, often in public places where the noise and crowds helped mask their conversations. Even within the cartel, information was shared only on a need-to-know basis, reducing the risk of leaks or betrayals. As their operation expanded, the cartel forged connections with suppliers and distributors in other cities, laying the groundwork for a larger network. These relationships were built on trust but maintained with caution, as one wrong move could destroy the entire pipeline. The cartel's leadership was careful to remain anonymous, conducting business through trusted intermediaries to avoid detection. With every successful shipment, their confidence grew. What started as a small group of street dealers was becoming a powerful and sophisticated organization capable of operating across countries. The cartel's tactics made it nearly impossible for police to catch them, and for a time it seemed like the operation was unstoppable. But as they pushed further, they also began to attract the attention of more determined law enforcement agencies ready to fight back with new strategies of their own. The stakes were about to get much higher. Once the drugs reached Dublin's docks, the cartel faced the next challenge: moving the shipments across the Irish Sea to Liverpool. This wasn't just a simple ferry ride. It was a carefully coordinated operation that involved multiple players working in sync. Liverpool's docks were crowded and chaotic, making them both a perfect hiding place and a dangerous environment to navigate. The cartel knew that controlling this critical point in the pipeline was essential to their success. Liverpool had long been a hub for international shipping, with containers arriving and departing around the clock. This constant movement created a veil of confusion that the cartel used to their advantage. The docks were busy, noisy, and full of people who rarely questioned the flow of goods. To slip through unnoticed, the cartel established connections with certain dock workers and truck drivers who were willing to help, often in exchange for money or protection. These dock workers played a vital role in unloading shipments quickly and quietly. They knew the layout of the docks and how to move containers without attracting attention. Some were responsible for swapping containers or moving the illicit cargo to nearby warehouses where it could be stored or repackaged. Truck drivers would then transport the drugs further inland, distributing them to smaller gangs and dealers across the region. The cartel's presence in Liverpool was built on a mixture of intimidation and loyalty. Some workers were coerced into cooperation, while others joined willingly, attracted by the profits or the power that came with being part of a larger criminal network. This underground support system helped the cartel operate with a level of efficiency that surprised many law enforcement officials. Despite the cartel's success, the crowded docks were a constant risk. Every shipment carried the danger of being intercepted by vigilant police or customs officers. To manage this, the cartel kept tight control over timing and information flow. They scheduled shipments during busy hours to blend in with the traffic, and used signals to coordinate when containers would be moved. Their operations were like clockwork, with every step planned to avoid mistakes. This connection between Dublin and Liverpool created a powerful pipeline, linking two cities through crime and secrecy. As the cartel's control grew stronger, so did their reach. But this growing empire also meant more eyes watching, more pressure from law enforcement, and a dangerous game that could collapse with just one wrong move. The stakes were high, and the cartel's journey was only just beginning. As the cartel's grip tightened across Dublin and Liverpool, the balance of power in both cities began to shift. The smooth flow of drugs brought enormous profits, but also rising tensions. Smaller gangs who had once ruled local neighborhoods suddenly found themselves being pushed aside. The cartel, now well-funded and well-organized, was swallowing up territory, suppliers, and markets with quiet aggression. For those already operating in Liverpool's underworld, this new force was a direct threat. The conflict didn't stay quiet for long. In parts of Liverpool, turf wars erupted, as rival gangs tried to fight back against the cartel's growing influence. Shootings, arson attacks, and violent confrontations became more frequent. Local communities found themselves caught in the middle, watching their streets turn into battlegrounds. Once peaceful neighborhoods became zones of fear, where silence became survival and loyalty came at a steep price. The cartel responded with calculated force. They didn't want to draw too much attention, but they couldn't afford to appear weak. When rivals crossed certain lines, they were dealt with quickly. Disappearances became common. Murders were made to look like accidents or never solved. Behind the scenes, the cartel sent clear warnings to those thinking of resisting: step aside or be removed. Law enforcement noticed the spike in violence and began to connect the dots. There were whispers of a larger force operating behind the scenes, but no concrete evidence. The cartel's structure remained hidden, and its leadership was insulated by layers of intermediaries. Every time the police arrested a courier or a street-level dealer, the top remained untouched. Frustration grew inside police departments on both sides of the sea. Meanwhile, the cartel's leadership worried about the attention the violence was attracting. They held secret meetings to discuss damage control. Some wanted to scale back operations temporarily, while others argued that this was the moment to push harder and fully take control. The divide among the cartel's leaders created a growing sense of unease. Power struggles and mistrust began to surface, quietly threatening the unity that had made them successful. At the heart of the conflict was one key question: how far were they willing to go to protect the pipeline? As the cartel expanded, the risks multiplied. With every new territory conquered, they made more enemies. The dream of a smooth-running empire was slipping into something darker, more violent, more chaotic, and increasingly unstable. The criminal pipeline, once silent and hidden, was now echoing with the sound of conflict. Deep within the cartel's operation, where trust was currency and silence was survival, one man began to waver. Known to most only by a nickname, he had been with the organization from its early days in Dublin. Loyal, reliable, and efficient, he managed logistics, tracking shipments, coordinating drivers, and securing storage locations. He wasn't just a foot soldier, he was a trusted figure, one of the few who knew how the entire pipeline functioned. But over time, the weight of what he saw began to wear him down. He had watched young people overdose on the drugs he helped move. He had seen friends disappear without a trace for asking the wrong questions. The violence was getting closer, and the fear never left. Each night brought the same thoughts. How long until someone turned on him? How long until a single mistake cost him his life? He knew too much, and that knowledge was both his value and his curse. What pushed him over the edge wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a murder or a betrayal. It was something smaller, a missed payment to a grieving family, a senseless act of cruelty by someone higher up, a reminder that loyalty meant nothing. Quietly, without telling anyone, he began to collect information. He wrote down names, times, shipment details. He mapped out routes and noted which warehouses were being used. He remembered every face and every false identity. Eventually, he made contact with a detective from the organized crime unit in Dublin. It was a calculated risk, but he saw no other way out. If the cartel found out, he'd be dead within hours. But if he stayed silent, he knew he'd eventually become just another casualty in a system that discarded people as quickly as it used them. The information he provided was explosive. It revealed how drugs were hidden, how the Liverpool connection worked, and who was involved on both sides of the sea. The authorities were stunned by the level of detail. They began quietly planning a response, knowing that acting too soon would tip off the cartel. Meanwhile, the informant continued to pretend nothing had changed. He still went to meetings, still gave orders, still played his part. But every step he took was part of a larger game now. One wrong word, one wrong glance, and it would all collapse. Inside the cartel, no one suspected a thing yet. But the foundation of their empire had been cracked from within, and the countdown had begun. With the insider feeding a steady stream of information to law enforcement, the balance began to shift. What had once been an unstoppable criminal machine was now unknowingly playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Armed with detailed knowledge of the cartel's operations, the authorities launched a series of quiet investigations and low-profile surveillance missions. They weren't ready to strike yet, but they were watching, waiting and learning. Shipments that once slipped through customs, unnoticed, were now being tracked. Agents disguised as dock workers and drivers began appearing at key points in the supply chain. Unmarked vans followed trucks through city streets. Phone calls were monitored, meeting spots photographed, and patterns documented. For the first time, law enforcement could predict the cartel's movements rather than simply reacting to them. But the cartel didn't sit still. Almost instinctively, it began adapting. Disguised as dock workers and drivers began appearing at key points in the supply chain. Unmarked vans followed trucks through city streets. Phone calls were monitored, meeting spots photographed, and patterns documented. For the first time, law enforcement could predict the cartel's movements rather than simply reacting to them. But the cartel didn't sit still. Almost instinctively, it began adapting. When one route was compromised, they opened two more. When a warehouse was flagged by police, it was emptied overnight and abandoned. New players were brought in under false names, and older members vanished without warning. The organization morphed constantly, like a living creature sensing danger. Every successful interception raised the stakes. Seizures became more frequent, but arrests were rare. The police wanted the top. They weren't interested in the low-level couriers anymore. They needed proof of leadership, of planning, of coordination between Dublin and Liverpool. The insider helped, but he was just one man, and even he didn't have access to everything. His information was gold, but the risk of exposure grew each day he stayed inside. Tensions within the cartel also began to rise. Confusion set in as shipments disappeared without explanation. Some believed they had a mole, while others blamed rivals or simply bad luck. Accusations were whispered. Loyalty was questioned. Meetings became colder, shorter, and filled with unspoken suspicion. A sense of paranoia began creeping into the highest levels of leadership. Meanwhile, the police faced their own pressure. The clock was ticking. They knew the cartel might shift entirely if they waited too long. But if they moved too early, the operation could scatter, leaving only fragments to clean up. Both sides were making moves, testing each other, waiting for the perfect moment. The once smooth pipeline was now a battlefield of strategy. Each interception was a message. Each move, a gamble. With every passing day, the line between hunter and hunted blurred. The game was no longer just about drugs. It was about survival, deception, and the quiet war unfolding beneath two cities. The cartel had always thrived on control. Every move was calculated. Every member kept in line through fear, loyalty, or the promise of wealth. But now, with shipments being intercepted and whispers of betrayal growing louder, that control began to slip. Inside the organization, cracks were forming, small at first. But growing with every day, the operation didn't go as planned. Leaders at the top were no longer confident in each other. Meetings that once ended with clear plans now turned into tense exchanges filled with suspicion. Fingers were pointed. Some believed law enforcement had gotten lucky. Others were convinced someone inside was leaking information. Paranoia began to take root. Trust, the glue that held the cartel together, was dissolving. Several mid-level players, afraid of being blamed for the losses, started to distance themselves. Some disappeared entirely, going off-grid to avoid retaliation. Others turned reckless, making mistakes that only attracted more attention from authorities. Internal discipline faltered. Members who were once loyal began holding back information, skipping meetings, or refusing to carry out tasks unless they were paid up front. The cartel, once a tightly run machine, was now struggling to function under its own weight. To maintain their grip, the leadership responded with violence. One courier, suspected of talking to police, was found dead in the outskirts of Dublin. Another went missing in Liverpool, last seen leaving a warehouse tied to a recent seizure. These actions were meant to send a message, but instead they deepened the fear and chaos. Members began watching their own backs more than watching out for the operation. Meanwhile, law enforcement noticed the shift. Surveillance showed longer gaps between shipments, changes in personnel, and signs of confusion. The insider reported growing instability and mentioned that key players were starting to question the entire operation's future. The cartel was under pressure from all sides, police closing in, rivals circling, and internal fractures threatening to split it apart. Even at the top, alliances were fraying. One of the founding leaders was suspected of hoarding profits. Another was accused of cooperating with outside gangs without approval. Once partners, they now viewed each other as threats. With no clear enemy to fight, the cartel began turning on itself. The structure that had taken years to build was now vulnerable. What made them powerful, their secrecy, their network, their discipline, was unraveling. And as the internal chaos grew, it became clear that the downfall wouldn't come from a police raid alone. It might come from within. As the cartel's internal collapse accelerated, law enforcement saw a rare opportunity. After months of surveillance, wiretaps and intelligence from the insider, all eyes turned to Liverpool's docks, the beating heart of the drug pipeline. This was where shipments were received, processed, and quietly pushed into the streets. Cutting off this access point wouldn't just disrupt the cartel's flow, it could destroy the entire operation. Plans for a massive coordinated strike were drawn up in secret. Agencies from both sides of the Irish Sea worked together, sharing intelligence and resources. The operation, codenamed Breaker, was designed to hit fast and hard, targeting key locations at the same time to prevent any chance of escape or retaliation. Surveillance teams tracked containers, identified safe houses, and located stash sites. Every move was mapped out with precision. In the early hours of a damp Wednesday morning, the operation began. Undercover officers already inside the docks signaled when the suspected shipment arrived. Dozens of unmarked vehicles rolled in, and heavily armed units stormed warehouses, shipping yards, and nearby apartments. Helicopters hovered above, while teams spread through the maze of containers. The chaos was immediate. Shouts, sirens, and the sound of metal being torn open filled the air. The cartel was caught off guard. With their structure already weakened by internal conflict, they were in no position to mount a coordinated defense. Some members tried to flee but were intercepted. Others surrendered without a fight, realizing there was no escape. In a single day, multiple key players were arrested. Several tons of narcotics were seized, and the docks were shut down under police control. But the victory came with a cost. A few shipments had already made it through in the days leading up to the raid, vanishing into the streets. Some high-ranking members, including one of the cartel's top figures, managed to disappear before the police arrived. The insider's identity was now at risk, forcing authorities to relocate him under heavy protection. Still, the operation dealt a massive blow. Without access to the docks, the pipeline was broken. Supplies dried up, prices on the streets soared, and rival gangs scrambled to fill the vacuum. Communities that had lived under the cartel's shadow for years began to see a change, even if only temporary. The fall of the docks wasn't just the collapse of a smuggling point. It was the unraveling of an empire. But while law enforcement celebrated, they knew the fight was far from over. Some pieces were still in play, and the game hadn't yet ended. In the weeks following the dramatic takedown at the Liverpool docks, the true scale of the cartel's operation began to emerge. As arrested members faced interrogation, more details surfaced: names, financial records, offshore accounts, and an intricate web of shell companies used to clean dirty money. What had once seemed like a vague shadow organization was now laid bare, piece by piece, for the public and the courts to see. The trials that followed captured national attention. News outlets ran daily coverage as prosecutors revealed how deeply embedded the cartel had in both Dublin and Liverpool. Evidence showed how legitimate businesses had been used as fronts: construction firms, import companies, even cafes and car washes. Money flowed in and out, masked as regular income. Some business owners had knowingly partnered with the cartel. Others had been threatened into silence. Families of overdose victims came forward, sharing heartbreaking stories of how drugs from the pipeline had torn lives apart. Parents wept as they described children lost to addiction. Community leaders demanded answers about how such a large operation had gone unnoticed for so long. For many, the revelations brought closure. For others, it brought anger, especially at those who had helped the cartel prosper in exchange for profit or protection. Corruption also surfaced. A few public officials and law enforcement officers were quietly investigated. Whispers of bribes and warnings tipped off to the cartel added another layer of betrayal. Though not all accusations led to charges, the damage was done. Trust in the system had been shaken. Despite the massive blow dealt to the cartel, not all members faced justice. Some slipped through the cracks, vanishing with forged identities or retreating into hiding. Others remained in prison, refusing to speak, knowing that silence might protect their families on the outside. The insider, whose information had been critical to the takedown, was relocated and disappeared from public view. His role remained classified, a ghost in the story. Meanwhile, communities began the slow process of healing. Outreach programs were expanded, addiction services received more funding, and new police units were formed to prevent a resurgence. But scars remained. In both cities, the cartel had left behind more than just violence and drugs. It had created a culture of fear, silence, and broken trust that wouldn't disappear overnight. The trials may have ended in convictions, but the battle against organized crime was still far from over. What had been exposed was only one part of a much larger network, one that could easily reappear under a different name in a different place, with the same deadly consequences. The cartel was gone, at least in name, but its influence didn't vanish with the arrests and convictions. What remained was a shattered network, scattered but not entirely destroyed. The pipeline between Dublin and Liverpool had been severed, but the conditions that allowed it to thrive still lingered. Poverty, addiction, broken communities, and the constant lure of easy money. As law enforcement celebrated a major victory, others braced for what might come next. With the cartel's collapse, a power vacuum emerged almost instantly. Rival gangs, once pushed into the shadows, began to resurface, each one eager to claim pieces of the fallen empire. The absence of a central force led to unpredictable violence, shorter, sharper, and more chaotic. Turf wars broke out in areas that had only just begun to recover. For many, it felt like starting over, with no guarantees of lasting peace. Authorities remained on high alert. Surveillance efforts continued, targeting known associates of the cartel and monitoring any signs of a new operation forming. In both cities, police shifted focus from reaction to prevention. They worked more closely with community leaders, launched new outreach efforts, and invested in technology to track evolving smuggling tactics. But the challenge was constant. Criminal networks didn't disappear. They adapted. In Dublin, younger groups started mimicking the cartel's old methods, copying everything from smuggling routes to money laundering techniques. In Liverpool, whispers of foreign gangs trying to move in grew louder. The warning signs were clear. If the vacuum wasn't filled with stability, it would be filled with more crime. The lessons of the past couldn't be ignored. Despite the danger, there was hope. The massive investigation had sparked change. The public was more informed. Officials were more prepared. Families affected by addiction found renewed support. There were new programs in schools, job training opportunities, and visible efforts to rebuild trust in communities that had been long neglected. But the story of the Dublin-Liverpool pipeline serves as more than just a cautionary tale. It's a reminder of how quickly organized crime can